Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I have hosted First Person since it began at the museum in 2000. We are in our 25th year. Each month, we share firsthand accounts of survival during the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. Holocaust survivors are Jews who experienced the persecution and survived the mass murder that was carried out by the Nazis and their collaborators. This included those who were in concentration camps, killing centers, ghettos, and prisons, as well as refugees or those in hiding. Holocaust survivors also include people who did not self-identify as Jewish, but were categorized as such by the perpetrators. During our program, please send us your questions and let us know where you are watching from in the live chat. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Andy Jampoler share his firsthand account of survival with us. Andy, thank you for joining us and for agreeing to be our first person today.
Bill, I'm happy to be here, and thank you for your kind invitation. I think what you're doing is very important. I'm pleased to be a part of it.
Thank you, and we are very much looking forward to all that you have to share with us. And we'll go ahead and get started, Andy. We'll begin our program a bit differently today. Instead of starting with your past, let's go back to just 2019. Until then, you did not know what you and your family experienced during the Holocaust. Please tell us about what made it possible for you to share your account of what you experienced with us today.
I learned the details of my experience as a very small child in Poland during the war and immediately after it from a woman, Irka, who turns out to be a cousin of mine who lived through that same horrific experience. And a number of times during the course of the war, we two intersected. She is a young teenager, me as an infant in arms. It was Irka's book and later a meeting with her that told me who I was and how I'd come to be. This is a copy of Irka's book. It is her autobiography, her experiences during the war and in the immediate post-war period. And reading it a few years ago was the first time I learned what had happened to me and how I had survived the horrors that we are studying today.
That's extraordinary, Andy. Tell us about actually meeting your cousin Irka.
This is a picture of the two of us in Melbourne, Australia, a few years ago. After we had exchanged correspondence, after I was advised that there was such a person and made contact with her, and we exchanged correspondence and calls. By sheer coincidence, I was on a cruise ship. I used to lecture on cruise ships, passing through Australia, and we had a chance to meet. This picture here is our first meeting since I was 4, and she was a young teen in Lublin in eastern Poland. In those many decades separating us, in this picture, you see us catching up over those decades, enjoying each other's company enormously. She was a brave woman, and more than that, she was the scribe of my life that was a mystery to me until I read her book and met her in person.
Andy, I know that we probably won't get much of a chance to get to this at the end of the program, but I just think it's remarkable that you happened to be on a cruise because you are this very accomplished author of a number of books, and there you were on a cruise with that opportunity to actually meet Irka. During today's program, Andy, most of what you are able to share with us from what you just told us is really what you know because of Irka and because of that book. Yes. World War II began in September 1939. Your father, Karol, and your mother, Hanka, were living in Lviv, Poland, which today is in Ukraine. Initially, this city was under Soviet occupation, but in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, including Lviv. Your mother was pregnant with you at the time. What can you tell us about your parents and how their lives changed once the Germans took control?
Their lives changed profoundly and fundamentally. My father was the younger son of a prosperous Polish lawyer in Lviv. His older brothers, 7 years his older brother, had long since left Europe for the United States via passage through the Spanish Civil War. My mother was the middle daughter of a successful architect, Joseph Avin, in Lviv. She was a high school student at the same time that my father was a student at Lviv's well-known music academy. He was studying to become an orchestra conductor. She was just growing up as the middle child of a successful architect. They met, and under the pressures of the war, married as very young people and had me very soon after that marriage.
Andy, from what you've shared with me before, it sounds like your parents were and their parents were well assimilated into Polish society.
I think that's correct. I know the family spoke Polish, not Yiddish. I don't know how observant they were of Jewish religious traditions and practices. My instinct is they were largely secular. I conclude this only because of my post-war experience with my mother and grandmother. But they were a large, successful, and happy family until the horrors of the war struck. First, the collectivization under the communists, and then the deliberate destruction and murder under the Nazis.
And Andy, what do you know about your father's brother?
My father was the youngest son of two. His brother, Herbert Olaf Maximilian, the family tends to run in four names for its male children, had left Poland years before. He and his wife, his first wife as it would turn out, fought in the Spanish Civil War against the Nazis, against the fascists in that war, not Nazis, and on the communist side. They lost that war. Herbie and his wife fled Europe via Portugal for the United States, and he was working in New York City at the time that we were still in Europe during the war, and subsequently when we sailed for New York, he was there at the other end to help us make that adjustment. Herbie died in 1970, the autumn of 1970, in a glider accident. He was flying in New Hampshire and lost control and died. It was a great tragedy to me. He was a model of a human being, as I grew.
Thank you for that, Andy. Your family went into hiding in Lviv to avoid being forced into a ghetto by the Nazis. Your mother gave birth to you on January 15th, 1942, while she and your family were in hiding. What can you tell us about the circumstances of your birth?
I was born, I believe, in my grandmother's apartment in the city. Hospitals were not accessible to Jews at the time. And I think I was born, and the first few weeks of my life spent in hiding in her apartment. Very soon after my birth, the family decided to flee Lviv, fearing, I think, the continuation of the deliberate German campaign of murder in the streets and in the camps of the city. And so we in this case meaning my grandmother, as it turns out my great-grandmother as well, my mother and father, and Irka, my cousin, left Lviv and went to Warsaw.
Andy, before we go on, if you don't mind, I'm just going to let you know that we have viewers watching and listening to you from all over the United States as well as other parts of the world. So today we have with us viewers from Connecticut, Illinois, Kentucky, and California. And I'd also like to extend a welcome on your behalf to our viewers from Malta, Italy, Austria, the United Kingdom. So we have eyes on you and ears listening to you from all over the place. Andy, you, as you began to tell us, while in Lviv, your family knew that their lives were in danger. Tell us about your paternal grandmother, Lucy, and how she tried to protect you.
Lucy was a rock through all this crisis. She was an exceedingly tough and capable woman. She was the leader of the small family group that we were as we fled from Lviv to Warsaw. In Warsaw, we would hide out in an apartment very briefly because that apartment would soon be discovered when a classmate of my father's from a music school ran across him in the street and was brought to our hideout and reported us to extortionists. That was the event that triggered the dissolution of the family.
And Andy, before we continue on to that, would you share with us, while you were in Lviv, I believe your grandmother Lucy played a pivotal role in helping to get false identities for the family. Will you tell us about that, because that is so essential to your story?
And without those false identities, I think the story would have ended very abruptly, much earlier. Her neighbor was a Catholic priest named Joseph Zafra. Here's a picture of him. He remained a priest through the war, lived through the war, died in 1970 as an old man. He very kindly provided the family with counterfeit papers, counterfeit birth certificates, and in several cases, counterfeit marriage licenses. And it was these false documents that permitted us to move relatively safely, although very warily, from Lviv to Warsaw. And the same false documents permitted my mother and her, and my grandmother, her mother-in-law, to hide in Germany, in southern Germany, through the entire course of the war on a pig farm in Immenstadt, Bavaria. All this was the gift of this brave priest, who we honored later, and we'll talk about that later.
And I think that the priest was actually, he knew your grandmother Lucy in some way, right?
They were neighbors.
They were neighbors.
His church backed up against her home property, and they knew each other obviously personally rather than professionally. But he's a man of extraordinary courage.
And I think we actually have an image of one of those false documents. Tell us about this, Andy.
This pretends to be my birth certificate. That's what it says on top in Polish. My name, Jampoler, Andrew Christopher Alexander, is there on that first line. It has all the stamps and seals necessary to make it look like an official document of the Archdiocese of Warsaw. And it says that I was born on the 15th of January, 1942. My father's name was Carol. My mother's name was Hanka. There they are there. And as I say, stamps, seals, and signatures to make this an absolutely official document, even though it's a complete fraud.
And as you've noted before, your full name and your parents and the birth date that's all true. It's just everything else is false. Yeah,
absolutely. That's all. That part of it is correct.
And I noticed your earlier comment. There's 4 names in your name, right?
That seems to be a family practice. Herbert Olaf Maximilian, the uncle I talked about. Curiously enough, my father was Carol Richard only. He didn't have a third name. But I'm not sure what that was about, but there it is.
Okay. Andy, I'd like to take a moment to remind our audience to please share any questions that you have for Andy via the chat. And we do have a question or a comment that's come in, actually. This is from Laura, and Laura writes, I wanted to say thank you for being vulnerable and open. I'm glad you are alive. Never forget. So that's from Laura, who's viewing you today.
Laura, I'm glad I'm alive as well, and I'm grateful to you for your kind comment. Let me take just a second to say a special hello to the people watching from Connecticut. I went to boarding school and summer camps in Connecticut for many, many years. It formed who I am today, and I have a special affection for that state and its citizens.
Thank you for doing that, Andy. That's nice. By the fall of 1942, with the false identities in hand, your family fled from Lviv to Warsaw. Why do you think they left Lviv at that point?
I think they left because the Germans had instituted a campaign of not simply oppression and savage repression, but murder. And I believe that my family fled fearing for our lives. And I think with good reason, given that we, the small group that escaped Lviv for Warsaw, were the only survivors in what was a large and prosperous family before the war.
Do you have any inkling as to why they may have chosen Warsaw?
I can only guess that it was easy to get to because as the capital of the country, the transportation system necessarily focused on that city, and it would probably have been easier to go from Lviv to Warsaw than anywhere else in Poland, but I don't know.
Okay. And once they fled Lviv to get to Warsaw, do you know where they were able to find hiding when they first got to Warsaw?
We hid out in Warsaw. I don't know where. I know it was on the east side of the river, for what good that is. But we hid out there for a very brief period of time because my father on the street was found by a classmate of his, of all things. And he brought his classmate home to our hideout. That classmate reported us to extortionists who appeared that same day, extracted money from my grandmother, terrified the adults as to what the consequences were. And what happened was my grandmother told my father to run and hide. And we too hid. My father, we never saw again.
And I know we're going to come back to that in a moment. When you went into hiding in Warsaw at that point before the extortionists came and your father left, who was with you at that particular point? Who was left of your small band, as you put it?
My great-grandmother, who had started out from Lviv with us, was not with us any longer. She died during the course of our trip to Warsaw. We believe now, Irka believes, when I say we, that was a suicide, that this old woman realized that she was slowing the group down, that she could not survive what was coming, and as an act of grace, left us and died in the streets. Who remained was my grandmother, Lucy, my mother, and my father, Irka, my cousin, and me.
And you.
And that was the group.
And your great grandmother, I believe Amalia Wilder was her name. I think you shared with me too that she had been raised in Austria, had a very different accent than those around, and I guess Irka speculated that she may have feared that would bring notice to her and therefore to you, and that's why she left, and as you've said, presumably committed suicide.
That was Irka's conclusion. It sounds credible to me. It was an act of sacrifice on this woman's part, of great sacrifice, one of the many that I would experience through the next several years of my life.
Just that description alone is just absolutely heartbreaking, Andy. Absolutely heartbreaking. Despite having these false identities, though, your family was subjected to constant threats of exposure. And as you mentioned, your father encountered a fellow former conservatory student who he'd gone to school with, encountered him in Warsaw. So say more about what happened. Somehow or another, he found out where you lived, evidently, and these extortionists came that you described.
My father brought his classmate home to where we were hiding out, and that was how this guy, this betrayer, found where we were hiding. He turned the extortionists loose on us. My grandmother bribed them, but knowing the certain consequences of staying in place, we fled again. And in the course of that departure, it became clear that my mother and grandmother could no longer care for me.
And Andy, if you don't mind, just a little bit more. Your father, as you said, left, and you never heard anything from him again. But later, much later in life, you've learned what happened to him. Will you tell us about that?
Very much later in life. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, when I started to work, to volunteer at the Holocaust Museum, in their archive, we discovered a document that said he was taken in the German labor battalion to the Crimea, and he died there, a prisoner of that labor battalion. My mother had after the war, for years, written the Red Cross and other agencies trying to find information about him. She never learned anything about him. And until I was at the museum a while ago, I had no idea what had prompted his disappearance. She never spoke to me about him.
And boy, that comes right on right after the losing your great grandmother. Just tragedy after tragedy. Andy, now with your father gone and your great grandmother gone, it's you and your grandmother, and they were also terrified by a group of blackmailers who appeared at your house, and they were able to escape from these blackmailers. Share with us a little about that.
The escape was facilitated by those false documents they had, but they realized they were no longer able to take care of me. They had to flee. I was left on the steps of a church in Warsaw. My mother and grandmother watched while I was taken inside by someone from the church.
Andy, I hate to do this to you, but I just know our audience will want to hear about how you actually escaped from those blackmailers out the window.
My mother tossed me out the window, and the women followed me. They couldn't go through the door because they were fearful that we were being surveilled. So they snuck out of the hideout into a park, camped overnight in this park, which was open to police and dogs and strangers and passersby and the weather. And after this camping in the park, they realized that this could not continue. They had to find some way to survive the war somewhere else.
And that, Andy, is when they made that profound decision that they believed would protect you. So you started to tell us what decision your grandmother and your mother made.
It was the essential decision. They knew they couldn't care for me, and that by bringing me along, my presence would complicate things such that it would risk everyone else. My mother and grandmother left me on the steps of the church. I got ahead of you, I'm sorry. And watched while I was taken inside. Remember now, I'm an infant in arms. Weeks old. It sounds almost biblical. Left at a church in swaddling clothes. And when they saw me taken inside, they fled. They left Warsaw looking for a place to hide, a place to live, something to do, and some way to make a living. They ended up in Immenstadt, Bavaria, on Frau Betz's pig farm. They would be farmers, pig farmers, covered by these false papers from our friendly priest through the rest of the war. Wow. My own life.
Andy, if I can interrupt you for a moment, I'd like to jump in with a comment from one of our viewers, if that's okay. Anna writes, such a heartbreaking but life-saving decision made by your mother and grandmother. I can't imagine carrying out such a painful but necessary act. No wonder women are often described as being made of steel. I'm so glad Mr. Jampoler and his family, Mrs. Jampoler and his family survived, and that I'm so glad that Mr. Jampoler and his family survived, and that he continues to share his story. Blessings upon you, Mr. Jampoler. That's from Anna.
Anna, that's very kind of you. I have been blessed. Surviving what I've just described to you seems like an extraordinary good fortune. And it was. I was adopted from the church by a Polish couple, surely a Catholic couple. They took me home, and there they are. They took me home with them to the city of Lublin, and I lived with them as their child. Jacek, they named me. I lived with them as their child through the rest of the war, through the remainder of the German occupation, and through the beginning of the Russian occupation. And they cared for me during those 4 years as if I would be their son forever.
This is Julie and Sta Matejczak. That was their family name, right?
Now, I knew nothing about this part of my life until Irka and her book and her narrative came. My mother and grandmother never told me I'd been left at a church, adopted by strangers, lived with them for years, and returned at the end of it. So this was news to me.
The fact that you were adopted was completely news to you?
Absolutely, completely.
Absolutely news. Wow.
Until I read this book and talked to her about it, I had no idea this had happened.
Wow. The Matejczaks, they changed your name, or they didn't change your name because they probably didn't know it. They gave you a name.
They called me Jacek, and that's who I was for the first 4 years of my life.
And Andy, as you started to tell us a few minutes ago, after leaving you at the church and seeing that at least you were taken in, your grandmother and mother began what had to be a remarkable saga, a journey for these two women. Even though they had these papers, the fear that must have surrounded them, traveled all the way to Germany. So we've got a question that's just come in from a viewer named Finley. Finley asks, did your mother or grandmother ever say what their work was like in Germany?
No. I know that they were on this pig farm, and I know the name of the woman who was there. They never spoke to me about their wartime experiences, just as they never told me anything about mine. This part of our lives was a complete mystery to me, and I was content to leave it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So fairly recent. And how they survived, it must have been horrific. Fearful, hardworking, dangerous, anxiety-ridden.
And Andy, just even apart from the fear and terror of exposure and all those things, on top of that, given the background that your mother and grandmother had come from, refined, people find themselves working on a pig farm to supply food for the Germans. That must have been just an extraordinarily awful time for them.
I can't imagine it, but
yeah.
You're right. A daily horror and a daily fear, not just simply horror, but fear of exposure and the certain destruction that would follow.
Andy, after the war, you were reunited with your grandmother and later with your mother, which just seems, in light of everything you've shared, just truly amazing. Your grandmother, Lucy, and your cousin, Urka, who you've mentioned throughout the program, they managed to find you back in Poland. So again, setting the stage, your mom and grandmother have gone off to Bavaria, Urka somewhere else, and then somehow or another, your grandmother, Lucy, and Urka come together and find you. Tell us about that.
My mother remains in Bavaria. She is in poor health and in and out of hospital, medical facilities there. My grandmother resolves to try to find me. She goes to Warsaw to the church. How she reconnected with Irka, who was a young teenager, had spent the war as a housemaid in Austria, I have no idea. But they reconnected and determined to try to find me. They went to the church, asked the church and inside the priest. He was a new man and did no recollection of any of this. But in the food stalls in the market surrounding the church, there were some people who said, oh yeah, there was a little boy here, and he was taken away by the Matejczaks, who live in Lublin and had, I guess, a stand in the food stalls. Lucy and Irka, according to Irka's book, go to Lublin to the city hall, where armed with the name of these people, they're able to extract an address. And they proceed to that address and appear and begin what Irka describes in her book and in audio, what amounts to a 4-day negotiation for my return on the strength of the argument that surely I will be better off growing up in the United States, where we had permission to emigrate to, than I would be growing up in Eastern Poland under Russian occupation.
In fact, as you know, we have a clip of Urka herself, who gave testimony to the Jewish Holocaust Museum in Melbourne, Australia in 1996, describing this tense situation when they found the Matejczaks. Let's go ahead and hear directly from Urka.
It was a very dramatic situation. because my aunt didn't have any proof, she didn't have any documents, she didn't have anything to prove that that's her grandchild. People who had the boy, they were very attached to him. And they didn't want it even to hear about giving him back. They started to quarrel between themselves. The man with the woman, he was angry. He told her in front of us, "You see, I told you not to get attached to that boy, to that baby. I told you maybe that's a Jewish baby and one day somebody will come and claim him. So don't get attached, so better maybe we won't keep him." Anyway, it was crying and shouting, and the boy heard everything and he started to cry. To make the story short, they agreed. My aunt promised. She has nothing to give them. She couldn't pay. She couldn't give them nothing. She just promised that after she will return to America, her son will send them some money.
And Andy, the son that she references there, that might send some money. I think that was a reference to your father's older brother.
Absolutely. She's talking about Herbie. Absolutely.
Herbie. And Andy, you just saw this clip fairly recently, but Urka gave it in 1996. What's it like for you to hear Urka describing that situation all about you?
It's stunning. This entire story came upon me sort of all at once. I had no idea that there was audio of Urka talking about her part in those negotiations. But I knew from her book, which I'd remind our audience, I read in my 70s for the first time. I knew from her book that there had been such a negotiation, that it was bitter and loud and argumentative, and finally ended up with their agreement. But to hear it from Irka, who sat there, and we have a picture of her there, it's stunning.
Yeah. And now we have a photo of your family with the Matejaks. Tell us what this photo represents. It's a happy looking photograph for the most part.
This is that moment in my mind when they agreed to give me to my grandmother. My grandmother is the woman in the top left. To her left is Irka with a kind of a fuzzy hairdo there. The couple to either side of me are the man and the woman who for 4 years now have raised me as their son, and in expectation, I think, that I would be theirs forever. This picture marks the moment at which they made the enormously generous decision to turn me loose, to give me to my grandmother, and to help me live the rest of my life in what they understood would be the United States.
That's a profound photo for you to have.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Andy, you mentioned, of course, Urka, who's reconnected with you now at this point, but she'd been gone, absent, and survived somehow in Austria, I think you said. And how did she manage that, to your best knowledge?
I don't know. She went to Austria alone. She lived there as a housekeeper to some Austrian family, I imagine. How she traveled back and forth, how they reconnected in Warsaw are mysteries to me. But it's representative of the extraordinary courage and, frankly, toughness of these women, one young, one old, that they were able to do this immediately in the aftermath of this horrifically destructive war that had shattered Central Europe and its transportation systems. I'm just astonished by it.
I'm just imagining that even the ability to travel by rail could have been almost virtually impossible because of all the destruction.
Absolutely.
Andy, while Urka and your grandmother were looking for and then finding you, your mother was ill and hospitalized. What can you tell us about her circumstances and her recovery?
I don't know the details, but she was frail and sick and hospitalized. And at the conclusion of the war, she's ended up in the displaced persons camp right near Immenstadt and spent time in that medical facility and remained there while my grandmother mounted this expedition in search of me. We three were reunited when my grandmother took me back to Bavaria, back to my mother, where we collected ourselves by train, proceeded to Bremen, and sailed for the United States. We actually had visas.
And I think, did you end up before you set sail? I think you actually ended up yourself in a displaced persons camp.
Yes, yes, with her, but I think that was essentially as a transient, waiting for all this stuff to sort itself out. This is a picture of us at about that time. I've always liked this hairdo on my mother. She wore it for many years. Let me pause just to say something about her. I've emphasized how frail she was and that she was hospitalized and things of this sort. This is a woman who lived her life successively in 5 different languages: Polish, German, Russian, English, and finally Spanish when she remarried and moved to Puerto Rico. Extraordinary courage represented by it. And she was just not a question of speaking the languages. She lived in them.
She lived those languages.
She invented herself 5 different times in the face of terrific challenges. I marvel. Anyway.
I have to comment, I can't help it, but just looking at your mother's wonderful wavy hair and yours, a complete match there. Andy, in July 1946, a little more than a year after the end of the war, you did come to the United States after you sailed from Bremen and came to the U.S. with your mother and with your grandmother, Lucy. Can you tell us anything about what made that possible? And then what happened once you arrived in New York City?
I have no idea how we got the visas to immigrate to the United States, or for that matter, the money to buy the tickets to do that. I attribute that to a combination of my grandmother and her oldest son, my uncle, but I don't know how we managed that. Visas were very difficult to obtain because the United States then, as we have been through our history, was unenthusiastic about welcoming the impoverished hordes of Europe or anywhere else. We arrived on the 26th of July in New York City, we 3. For a period of time, we had assistance from assistance agency of some description, humanitarian agency. They discovered that my grandmother had a bank account that she had concealed from them, and that cut off all that aid. She had resources that I have no idea what the source was or what their volume was, but this is a picture of her in a handsome fur coat and fur hat with me reasonably soon after we arrived in the city of New York. She was the reason why we survived.
You know, you referred to her as having resources. She had resources and also obviously an incredibly resourceful human being in every way. Yeah.
She's the reason why we survived. No question.
Andy, you were just 4.5 when you arrived in the U.S. Will you share with us your earliest memories of arriving here?
The earliest memories I have are living on the Midtown east side of New York City with the elevated trains clattering by overhead, with the enormous chain drive diesel trucks delivering ice and coal to the basement of the tenements on the ground. The crowds of people speaking all manner of languages. This area where we lived was very much a nesting place for foreigners. And I spent the first few years of my education at Public School 6 in New York City. That's where I learned how to speak English. That's where I began the passage that has led me to where I am today. And I recall the street scenes, and I recall translating from my grandmother as people spoke to her in English, and I told them in Polish what she told her in Polish what they were saying, and back and forth. Very soon, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please continue, yeah.
Very soon after New York City, only the 2nd grade, I went away to boarding school in Connecticut. I have no idea who paid for that. I spent a year at Litchfield Academy in Litchfield, Connecticut, and 8 years at the Cherry Lawn School in Darien, Connecticut, where I grew really to become who I am. That school shaped me indelibly. From there, thanks to Cherry Lawn, thanks to the dean, Lady Lee Craig, I got admission to Columbia College on a New York State Regents scholarship and grew very quickly into who I am today. I was an NROT. Go ahead.
And I hope before the end you will be able to tell us a little bit more about what you accomplished after that, which is truly remarkable. We do have a video question from a student named Jackie in Silver Spring, Maryland. If it's okay, let's go ahead and hear Jackie's question of you.
Hi, my name is Jackie Avalar, and I am from Silver Spring, Maryland. And my question is, how was coming to the United States and starting high school? Did you ever face discrimination or anti-Semitic phrases ever told to you during your time here in the United States?
Yeah, Jackie asks, how was coming to the United States and starting high school, and did you ever face discrimination and anti-Semitic phrases during your time here?
In reverse order, no, I never faced any discrimination. I'm certain that that's because I didn't practice Judaism. I didn't practice any religion at all. I went to school as a young kid, a young secular kid, studying what I was told to study, and I experienced no prejudice whatever, either there or in the several summer camps that somebody generously sent me to and paid for. It almost sounds like a charmed existence. I'm embarrassed because it was so easy in the face of the enormous difficulties that so many others faced who had survived the war at the same time.
Andy, you talked about your mother, what a remarkable woman she was, as well as your grandmother Lucy, and the fact that she, as you said, spoke, but more importantly, lived in 5 languages. Tell us a little more about how she adjusted to life in the United States.
My mother worked for RCA Victor, the record corporation east side of New York, downtown east side. Records were a big thing in the immediate post-war years. The LP, the long playing record, had just been invented, and it was an explosion in that form of entertainment. She worked there for years. In the late 50s, she met a neighbor of hers, or a neighbor of ours, except I didn't live with her very much. Jamie Yoma, Chilean engineer, Chilean house manager. They met in Queens, where they were both living. They married in 1958, the summer of 1958. I remember that because I was the witness at their wedding. And it was immediately after my high school graduation. And very soon thereafter, moved to Puerto Rico, where he had a job and where they had 2 children, my 2 sisters, and they raised their family. That move effectively completed the separation that the boarding schools and summer camps had begun. I would then spend very, very little time with my mother. And while I would, throughout my life, love and admire her, we didn't share much of those lives. And that has certainly shaped me.
Andy, as you shared at the beginning of our conversation today, it was only recently that you've discovered your family's Holocaust history once you reconnected with your cousin Urka in Australia. Please tell us what it was like for you to learn all of this about yourself, your life, your family, when you were already well into your own 70s.
Unsettling is an inadequate word to describe that. We are, I think, used to thinking that life proceeds from day to day and we understand ourselves as a consequence of this autobiography, of this self-history. That's not the case for me. I had and paid no attention to what I'd been, who I'd been, and who I was throughout the course of my life. I was focused on the present, focused on school first, my Navy service next, my various jobs after that, focused intently on my beloved wife, who's in the next door here, in the next room here, and the children we had and the lives that we were making. The narrative that you and I have just shared now is new to me, and I'm still adjusting to it. It's an odd situation to be in, it, approaching the end of days, to suddenly realize how it all began.
And my guess is that unsettling nature you described will unfold for a good while to come.
I would
And
like to.
Andy, do you have any insights at all as to why your mother and grandmother didn't talk to you at all about what they experienced and suffered through the Holocaust and World War II?
I think so. I think we today call it PTSD. The horrors that they had endured, the death, and the destruction of everything they knew, the death of everyone they knew, was so horrific that they suffered from what we today call post-traumatic stress. They were incapable of talking about it, of thinking about it, of dealing with it, and certainly were unwilling to share it with me, to put that burden on this small boy who grew up to be a young man and then much older. I think that's the reason why, for instance, my grandmother never told me who that man was, that young man was, in the picture in her bedroom in her apartment in New York City. It was her youngest son, my father. She never told me who that was. And I never asked. It never occurred to me to ask. But it is the only picture I have of him today. And it was that apartment photograph that she had. My mother, too, was immersed in work, immersed in memory, conducting a search for her husband, my father, that came up empty time and again. I know that from the archives now. And she wasn't going to inflict that on me either. And the consequence of my ignorance on the one hand, and my absence at school and camp, and if you add up the weeks, it was almost my entire life away from home. The consequence of that is I was completely ignorant of my origin story, ignorant of who I was and how I'd gotten to be. And not until Erica materialized did that become clear to me.
Andy, before we begin to close out, I want to be sure that you share with us something remarkable that you did together with Erica, and this is very recent. You and Erica were successful in having Father Joseph Safran, the Polish priest who provided the false papers to your family, recognized as righteous among the nations. Will you tell us about this?
I'm smiling because I'm really pleased at how this turned out. Soon after Erica and I reconnected, we began thinking about how we had gotten to where we were today. And it was clear that Father Safran had played an enormous role in his counterfeiting in permitting us to survive the horrors of the Holocaust. She and I nominated Father Safran to Yad Vashem, Holocaust Memorial in Israel, for recognition as one of the righteous among the nations. Those many who at grave risk to themselves, had exerted themselves to save Jews during the Holocaust. Some years, 2 or 3 years passed before the memorial agreed that yes, he was worthy of this recognition and he would be inducted into that Hall of Fame. This photograph shows the ceremonial end of that process when they are chipping his name into the monument, and surrounding that monument are our guests, 3 generations of my family. My daughter there in bright yellow, my wife in the corner behind me. My 2 sisters are there also back in the long on the right-hand side. All these people, including a few ambassadors from Europe who participated, all these people there to honor the memory of the brave priest who had made it possible for us to escape death in the Holocaust.
What a remarkable thing for you and Erica to have done in his memory. Andy, I have a couple of questions that have come in from viewers, if I can go ahead and ask them of you. One of our audience member asks, in light of what you described about learning all of this so late in life, do you ever wish you had learned this information earlier?
I never thought about that. Um, I don't know. Certainly, it might have made a difference to how I viewed myself. I'm not sure what the difference would have been. No, I think on balance, my mother and grandmother's instinct to protect me from these horrors was probably sound. It let me become what I believe to be the thoroughly American person that I became, without the baggage of the horrors that had been inflicted on our family. It wasn't until the ceremony at Yad Vashem that it occurred to me that I needed to pay homage to my ancestry and to my authentic biography. And it's why I volunteer at the museum today. Because
we sure are grateful that you're doing that. Andy, the other question that's come in, and this is from a viewer named Maggie. Maggie asks, have you been back to Europe?
Maggie, I've been back to Europe, but I've never been to Poland. I've never been to Ukraine, which is the part of Poland that I come from. My wife, Susie, and our daughter, Chrissy, went. I should have gone when the subject was being discussed. I declined. I'm not sure what provoked that act of cowardice, but I declined and did not go. They did, and came back with a much better understanding of who I was and by extension who they were. But I didn't.
Before I move to our very final question for you today, Andy, I'd like to share just one more comment from a viewer named Marcia. Marcia writes, I so appreciate that you are sharing with us such a painful, difficult story, and also a story of survival, heroism, and family love, even during a time of such pain.
You're kind, Marcia. You're generous and kind, and I thank you for that.
Andy, I have just one more question for you today, and that is, as we face a dangerous surge in anti-Semitism, please tell us why you feel it is important to share your firsthand account of the Holocaust and what people can and should be learning from you.
I volunteer at the museum for several reasons. One of them, as I've indicated to you, is to honor the memory of Father Zafran. The principal one, however, is it gives me an opportunity to tell museum visitors, believe what you see here. The horrors described in these various exhibits, in these several exhibits, really happened. The lives destroyed depicted here were really destroyed in the horrors of that war under the evil leadership of Nazi Germany. There are people who deny the truth of the Holocaust. For whatever political reasons they might have, they're wrong. And they know they're wrong. And I urge the visitors to the museum to understand that and to speak up against it, and for their part, to remember the horrors of the Holocaust are real. And if we as citizens of a great and powerful democracy don't act to ensure these kinds of crimes cannot be committed again anywhere, then they might. So it's our obligation to pay attention to what's going on and to act responsibly in support of true belief, of true courage, of true faith in the goodness of people and the kindness of strangers.
And Andy, in addition to doing what you're doing with us today, spending your time with First Person, you also go regularly to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and spend time there talking with visitors who happen to come into the museum and encounter you.
Exactly to that purpose I just described, to make sure as they leave, they believe what they've seen, they understand the horrors, and they will act as citizens in a great democracy to ensure that these kinds of things can never happen again anywhere.
Andy, thank you for your willingness to do this, not just today, but at the museum as well for sharing your powerful story. We're enormously grateful for it. We don't have time with our program to talk about all the amazing things that you went on to do. I believe a 24-year distinguished flying career in the United States Navy. You are a successful author. You've written, I believe, 8 books now that are published, and you have a 9th that's in the works as we speak. So there's just so much more to you, but the most important for us was to hear about your experience during the Holocaust, and we are just so grateful to you for doing this today.
And I'm grateful to you for providing this forum so that people can think about these enormously important issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andy. I'd like to take a moment to also thank our donor. First Person is made possible through the generous support from the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. And I'd also like to invite you to join us again next month for our next First Person program. So thank you all for being with us today and spending this time with Andy Jampoler.